Welcome to the China Show. We're half an hour to the open, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. I'm David Ingles here in Hong Kong.
And I'm Avril Hong in Singapore. Our top stories: oil and the dollar jump while U.S. stock futures slide as Israel launches airstrikes on Iran with reports of explosions in the capital, Tehran. Israel declaring a state of emergency, expecting retaliation. The U.S. says it's not involved in the Israeli attacks, with President Trump earlier warning that he preferred a diplomatic response to Iran's nuclear ambitions. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying he's seeking to remove an existential threat, with strikes to continue until that happens.
Right, we're continuing our breaking news coverage of confirmation now from Israel in the last hour or so that they have attacked Iran's nuclear program. In the last few minutes or so, Benjamin Netanyahu has ended his remarks on those strikes. He is seeking to remove the threats of ballistic missiles. Quite a reversal that we've seen across these markets, across assets. So equities, as you can see, are down 0.7 to 1%. Taiwan is just coming online, coming and falling out of the gates right now. S&P futures off 1.5%. So it's really a haven play. Gold, you have the yen, you have the Swiss franc, you have oil prices on the way up, 8% last we checked. Can we flip the boards, please, and have a look at where we are on Brent and West Texas? Let's call it 7% on that. Shanghai crude just coming online. The energy space is one of the few green spots across these equity markets, perhaps as a direct function of what's happening in the energy market. Right. The havens play, when you look at gold, for example, 3,400 already going into the news in the last hour or so. The FT, it's worth pointing out, of course, had been reporting that a strike would come as early as Friday. Hence, we were at 34. We're adding another $40 on top of that. We're trading now at 34.41 on gold futures. Yen. So with the exception of the yen and the Swiss franc, the dollar is up against everything with the exception of those two. Aussie yen, which is, I guess, is a pretty good indicator of risk appetite near term, is down the most since the week of Liberation Day. And going into the open today, we're down about 0.1 of 1%. We have a bond auction today. We'll tell you about that later. But yes, the top story today is a reversal higher in the U.S. dollar, Avril, on the back of the breaking news coming through on Israel and also Iran.
Yeah, which is interesting because we've been seeing how recently, amid geopolitical tensions, the dollar really not benefiting from a safe haven bid, but that seems to not be the case today. Now, for the latest, Bloomberg senior editor Derek Wallbank joins us now. So, Derek, first off, what do we know about exactly what was targeted, the scale of the damage in Iran?
Well, there's a very fast developing story here. Obviously, we are seeing strikes across heard across Tehran, and strikes across Tehran, and we're seeing Israel acting unilaterally, according to the United States, the U.S. saying that they were not involved in the strikes there. Israel has said that they are expecting retaliation from Tehran at some point reasonably imminently. And so Israel is on alert for all of that. The strikes are apparently targeting military targets as well as nuclear infrastructure. But again, it's very early days there. So we're just getting the very first statements on what may have been targeted.
Yeah, and Derek, to your point, I'll semi-act as a reporter here as well because we're looking at all our screens right now. So just to get our viewers up to speed on some of the latest here as well. So we understand that Iran has also suspended flights at the airport. We're looking at the IDF also, this one in the last, let's call it 10 minutes or so. Dozens of IAF jets have completed the first stage of those Iran strikes. And, okay, this is coming in right now as I speak. The state news agency in Iraq says Iraq has closed its airspace. Derek, let me bring you in terms of, and who knows what's next, but what possibly are the next few things we should be paying attention to this hour?
Well, David, I think this is a tremendously escalatory situation. It's very early days, but there are real risks with this level of escalation in terms of how far this goes and how much this spirals. Iran had pledged ahead of time that it was going to respond if Israel conducted any strikes. As I said, Israel has said that they are braced for potential actions across their homeland. So that's one point that we're watching. We did see the U.S. really distance in the very first statement from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He did say that this was a unilateral thing, that the U.S. wasn't involved. But Rubio also put in a warning in that statement to Iran to not go after U.S. interests or personnel in the region. We had seen the U.S. Pulled back from some people in the region, citing potential threats, and so there are some clear lines here, even as this is very, very early days. There are some clear lines sort of being drawn about what is expected as well as what could potentially escalate. Now, we don't have anything necessarily on the next round of talks between the U.S. and Iran that were meant to be taken this weekend. We don't have any indication about whether that's still happening or whether that has been pulled back or next steps there.
Derek. Yeah, Derek, sorry to interject, but please stay put as well. We're just getting more lines coming through as well. And it's worth pointing out, just very, very quickly, before we hear on the whys from Benjamin Netanyahu, CNN reporting earlier on that Donald Trump is planning a cabinet-level meeting after these strikes. In fact, earlier on, just before we came on air, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did end his remarks on the whys. Pay attention and have a look at what he had to say.
Genocidal calls with action and with a call of our own. Long live Israel and long live America. Our action will help make the world a much safer place. I want to thank President Trump for his leadership in confronting Iran's nuclear weapons program. He has made clear time and again that Iran cannot have a nuclear enrichment program. Today, it is clear that Iran is just buying for time. It refuses to agree to this basic requirement of peaceful nations. That is why we have no choice but to act, and act now. The hardest decision any leader has to make is to thwart a danger before it is fully materialized. Nearly a century ago, facing the Nazis, a generation of leaders failed to act in time. They were paralyzed by the horrors of World War I. They were determined to avoid war at all costs, and they got the worst war ever. They adopted a policy of appeasement. They closed their eyes and ears to all the warning signs. That failure to act resulted in...
Yeah, those were earlier statements in the last, let's call it 10 minutes or so, from the Israeli Prime Minister on what's just taking place right now. Just to reiterate, in case our viewers are just joining us right now, so attacking Iran's nuclear program and ballistic missiles, they are seeking to remove that threat. They will continue until the threat is removed. It's also worth pointing out that Israel, separately Iran, and separately Iraq have all closed their respective airspaces here. Derek, let's bring you back in, and thank you for standing by for us, Derek. Yeah, just your takeaway. Certainly, very early days. Markets are trying to figure out if this goes into the weekend, out through next week. Give us a sense of what, again, the next developments we should be paying attention to here over the next few days or so.
Well, thanks, David. Look, as I say, I think red lines is a play. You're looking for escalation. You're looking to see if this is one-off or if this is or if this is the start of something that is going to continue. All of those things are sort of early indicators. On market side, you're seeing oil up. You're seeing a flight to havens. That's to be expected with any sort of increased geopolitical risk here. But you're certainly seeing that there. You mentioned the airspace closures. That sort of global connectivity between Asia and Europe. Iran is a major flight path there. That's also something to keep an eye on. The scope of Iran's retaliation is probably one of the things I'm watching for the most right now. As I say, they had said they would retaliate if something happened. Something did indeed happen. What is the response going to be there? And then how does Israel respond to that? And again, it is really, really worth underlining here, because because as much as Netanyahu was citing the United States and citing Donald Trump, the U.S. was very, very clear in its first statement that Marco Rubio issued that was amplified by the White House that this was unilateral action from Israel, that Israel had said they felt that it was necessary, but that it was the United States was not involved in it, according to Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, who again warned Iran about any retaliation that may hit the United States, either interests or personnel.
Derek, we'll let you go. We know it's busy there in the newsroom there, as it is here, of course, here in Hong Kong, the newsroom behind me. Derek Wellbank, thank you so much, our senior editor there. As Derek was just pointing out here, it's classic textbook, very clear-cut move, risk-off sweep across these markets. Equities down, bonds are bid, dollar is bid, with the exception against havens. That's the yen, that's the Swiss franc. Gold is on the way up, as with Brent and West Texas up 7-8% right now as I speak. Let's get a sense right now of how markets will probably continue to move in the next few hours or so. Eddie Cheung is with us, senior EM strategist at Credit Agricole. Here with us on set. Eddie, we were going to talk about something different. News has forced us into this. Give us a sense of whether or not the risk premium will continue in these markets right now.
Well, I think, like you say, it's still very, very early days at this point in time. We don't know how Iran's going to retaliate. I think the major issue for Asia, at least it will be relatively isolated, but the impact is going to be coming via oil. A lot of the Asian economies are major oil importers, so clearly that is negative for the trade balance. I think the second thing is, of course, as you noted, risk-off.
Yep.
Markets, in my view, have been fairly inured to bad news, so it's been climbing the wall of worry. But now you have the S&P at these levels, and this event is suddenly happening. So it's like something coming out of the blue. So people are going to be a lot more risk-averse at this point in time, and I do expect, say, for example, the dollar have been weakening. We are seeing this kind of reversal. And actually, people, I think, have been probably getting a bit too bulled up on selling dollar Asia. So this is actually giving this a bit of a breather as markets reassess. Where do we go from here? Is this going to escalate a lot more? Does that mean the dollar heads a lot higher? Or actually, maybe people will think this is going to be very, very short-term in nature. Oil probably comes back off because we still have those OPEC hikes coming through.
Right.
So then maybe this would be giving markets another opportunity to sell. I think, again, for Asia, I still feel it's relatively isolated from this. It's only from those two main channels that we're going to see this come through.
I mean, you're right. A lot of this is really positioning, right? Extremely bearish positions around the dollar. The underlying global economy is in weak footing. To your point, we're getting more oil coming to the market. Just a point on this move in the dollar. Should we expect a short squeeze to continue, I guess, these let's call it next session or so, next day or so?
Yeah, I think right now the expectation is for a short squeeze because probably before that we were talking about euro. If we went above 115, 116 in euro dollar, the next level was 120.
Right.
So actually the dollar was supposed to head a lot lower from where we are now. We did see very short-term retracements in the dollar, but that was not unable to hold. But now, amidst all the uncertainty, I think the positioning is probably going to just be take off positions first, and then we'll see later, especially heading into the weekend. A lot of things can happen over the next 2-3 days. People are going to be more protective of their portfolios before they decide to take a longer-term view.
Eddie, Avril in Singapore here. I mean, to your point, we've also been seeing how the dollar has continued to be undermined by erratic policymaking out of the U.S. I mean, what needs to square away for us to see that turn?
Well, basically, our longer-term view for the dollar, at least into the end of this year, is we think the dollar is going to be under pressure. I think we're unlikely to see this shift. It's very difficult to see this shift in the erratic dollar policy making, U.S. policy making at this point in time. So from that point of view, I think that just keeps the dollar on the back foot. I think what we're also seeing is very important portfolio rebalancing out from the U.S. into Europe, into Asia. So in this environment, I think that continues. I think the only question right now is, in this risk-off environment, does that really bring a bit of a bid back into bonds? How long is that going to stay? And even if that stays, I think markets then at some point will go back to this big, beautiful bill, concerns about fiscal debt, and then yields probably head back a bit higher and the dollar softens again. So it's a bit of a push and go at this point in time. But does this mean a structural shift higher in the dollar? I think, firstly, it's still too early. Secondly, from the drivers that we see right now, we're not very convinced.
Mid to longer term, I mean, amid this portfolio repositioning that you're talking about, are you expecting further inflows for the likes of Korea or Taiwan, for example? And how supportive is that going to be for their currencies?
Well, clearly, this has been the big story for this week because we've seen tech come back. Taiwan, Korea, those were the two big movers yesterday in Asian currencies. Big inflows coming into Taiwan, exporters selling as well, pushing those two currencies lower. To a certain extent, also some sort of proxy hedging, basically pushing both currencies together. I think in the current environment, probably we see a bit of a pause. But that by no means, in my view, means that it's over. I think there is also some news. I mean, ahead of all of this geopolitical events, there was some positive headlines overnight on trade, basically saying for the more important 18 economies that the U.S. sees, basically there could be potential for an extension in terms of their trade talks. On one hand, we can argue, oh, that means trade talks are taking a bit longer. But on the other hand, what that means is actually there could be potential for good news for these economies. So in terms of the trade uncertainty surrounding the likes of Taiwan, Korea, which are seen to be a bit more friendly with the U.S., I think the longer-term view is even if we see a short-term pullback, the longer-term story is still there. One more thing for these two economies is what is very interesting in terms of the trade news that we're seeing is chips is still being exceptionally strong. If we look at the Taiwan trade numbers that just came out, there was a 60% year-on-year growth in tech exports. We're seeing a similar story for Taiwan, similar story for Korea. So that still remains a very, very important force pushing these two currencies higher.
I mean, even before today, Eddie, to your point, the Korean markets were the best performing lot year to date, quarter to date in the Asia Pacific. I think we're up 22% in the Kospi. It's certainly broken. I think we're 2022 highs on that. Just to mark as well for our viewers here, so NASDAQ futures are down 2% now. Invesco is out with a note that the strike on Iran will be weighing on stocks in India and the Philippines. As a separate note, Eddie, apart from this story and, of course, some of the other themes that you mentioned, is there anything else that we've so far has taken a backseat because of the news flow today? Anything else we should be paying attention to?
Well, apart from Taiwan, Korea, I'll probably say Hong Kong is always going to be interesting.
Okay.
I mean, dollar Hong Kong, one of the most actively traded currencies that we've been seeing recently in the region. Everyone's talking about when dollar Hong Kong will reach 785. The big story for Hong Kong has really been carry.
Yeah.
Basically, carry pushing it from 775 to 785. Now, if we reach 785, does that mean the story is over? Does that mean Hong Kong rates jump up higher? I think what we're likely to see when we reach 785 is we will see a shrinking of the aggregate balance, but probably a lot slower than the injections that came through. So we probably see dollar Hong Kong edge a bit lower. Hong Kong rates does climb higher, but not back to where we were in early April. I think we see 1 month HIBOR, we're now currently at 0.5. We can go up to probably about 1 to 2%. Another story for Hong Kong, of course, is going to be dividend season. We're entering dividend season now for Hong Kong. So that will kind of offset some of the pressures that we're seeing, to the upside pressures that we're seeing for dollar Hong Kong. When that happens, we're likely to see more repatriation coming through into Hong Kong, and then money is going to get paid out. So these will be interesting shifts in the dynamics that will impact this dollar Hong Kong story. And that's actually when we see a lot of clients, that's actually what a lot of clients are asking about recently.
Yeah, especially given, I mean, these are conditions we're not used to seeing. Eddie, sorry, one last question for you as we try and figure out what a a haven asset is. Treasuries were a big story this week. There was a 30-year auction, a 10-year auction. Are U.S. Treasuries still risk-free assets to you?
I think what we're actually seeing for U.S. Treasuries, the shorter dates, in my view, they still remain relatively steady, but we are looking for the steepening of the U.S. yield curve. I think longer term, U.S. fiscal concerns, they're unlikely to go away that quickly. We are seeing some sort of a de-dollarization theme coming through. I mean, this has been happening for a long time.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I think recently, given this U.S. trade uncertainty, policy uncertainty, that probably accelerates a little bit. But does that mean structurally the U.S. dollar is no longer a reserve currency? That's not going to be the case. I think if we're talking about U.S. Treasuries, I would still say TINA. There's no other alternative. There's no other strong alternative at this point in time. Yes, we can talk about bonds, we can talk about JGBs, but we can talk about CGBs. But the size of these markets right now really do not match the liquidity that we can see in U.S. Treasury markets. But I would be more differentiating at this point in time.
Okay.
Probably much more focused towards the short end than the long end.
Fantastic. Eddie, have a great weekend ahead.
Thank you.
Eddie Cheung there, Senior EM Strategist at Credit Agricole. Just very quickly here for our viewers and clients to keep on top of the Iran-Israel story, TLI Vigo, we have a blog ongoing right now, commentary, analysis, market moves, and everything in between here from our folks here at Bloomberg. Avril.
Yeah, Dave, and of course, the other big story we've been tracking as investigations begin into this crash of an Air India Dreamliner bound for London, with the U.S. president promising any assistance that the U.S. can offer. The airline says all but one of the 242 people on board the Boeing jet were killed in the crash in Ahmedabad, with teams searching scorched rubble on the ground for any other victims. Now, Bloomberg's aviation reporter Danny Lee is joining us from Bangkok for more on this. Danny, we know we've been relying on you to track this incident very closely. The fallout, obviously, it's been a very tragic loss of lives. Absolutely saddening to hear. Are we any closer to finding out what was the cause of this crash?
It's still very early days into the aftermath of this very tragic accident, and one of the early indications of trouble actually came immediately after the accident. We had a statement from the Indian civil aviation regulator highlighting the fact that the pilots, as soon as they took off from Ahmedabad airport, issued a mayday call, and that mayday call could indicate malfunction or a mechanical or technical issue that the pilots were facing. And furthermore, there was video on social media showing the plane taking off, that the plane was in the air for around 30 seconds and reached a peak altitude of 625 feet before descending and crashing into a residential neighborhood. And so with the number of deaths so far, only one survived of the 242 people on board. We are still yet to get a further handle on just how high the death toll was because of the nature in which it's crashed into a residential neighborhood. But this will obviously mark one of the worst civil aviation crashes anywhere in the world over in the past 10 years.
Danny, as you say, it's early days. We don't know what caused the crash, but it's involving a 787 Dreamliner. And this is coming at a time when Boeing and the new CEO had just been managing to turn things around, making some headway. I mean, what is the impact for the plane maker?
Yeah, for Boeing and equally for the airline involved, Air India, both going through their own kind of turnaround. For Boeing, first of all, the fact that it has been undergoing a huge change under the new CEO, Kelly Ottberg, who in fact, we've just reported, will not be attending one of the aviation industry's biggest events of the year, the Paris Air Show, just to deal with this ongoing crisis. Clearly for Boeing, it's had a litany of issues stemming back to the 737 MAX, a single-aisle jet, which is a different aircraft to the one involved in this accident. It had issues going back several years after two earlier fatal crashes. Clearly, it's had more recent issues which prompted the management change. And then for Air India, going through a huge modernization, moving from public into private ownership under the Tata Group, spending billions to overhaul its, not just its image, but its planes and expand. As India rises to become one of the biggest aviation markets out there. So it's a big blow for both organizations, but clearly we are still yet to understand more in the early days of this fallout from this accident. And one of the key things that we are waiting to hear for is whether the black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder has been found, to try and give some concrete answers to what has happened in this devastating crash.
The search for answers continues. Danny, thank you so much for bringing us the latest. Our aviation reporter, Danny Lee, in Bangkok for us. Still ahead, Safety Matters Foundation joins us with their insights and analysis on Air India's fatal air crash. Plenty more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back. Markets moving risk off, as you can see, following Israel striking nuclear sites in Iran. The U.S. says it's not involved. Israel is bracing for possible retaliation. Crude oil's on the way up. Havens are on the way up. Equities, as you can see, flip the boards, please, are on offer. We're going into the Hong Kong and China Open today, and as you can see there, still rather risk off. HS Tech down about 1%. Dollar China is on the way up as the dollar catching a bid against all, with the exception against the Japanese yen and the Swiss franc. And looking at oil stocks here in focus, given the 6, 7, 8% pop in oil prices. There you go, going into the open today. Plenty more ahead here on the China Show. Right, welcome back. And going into the open of cash markets in China and Hong Kong, we are looking at, I'm going to call it relative stability across some, but make no doubt about it, when you look more broadly in big picture right now, markets are on very manic footing going into this weekend following the breaking news just in the last hour or so that Israel has struck nuclear sites in Iran. Equities down, dollar up, yen up, gold up, oil up, energy stocks up. VIX futures are also to the upside. And what we're expecting here, Avril, going into the open today here in Hong Kong and up in mainland China.
Yeah, volatility is back. Havens are catching a bid, and we're seeing these energy stocks also in China. They seem to be helping to offset some of the declines in what is broadly a risk-off day. And looking at it, as you say, a bit stable when it comes to the mainland markets. Now, let's take a look at how Hong Kong is shaping up as well. As we see already, the rest of the region looking pretty negative. As one of our guests mentioned earlier, it's really going to be that read-through when it comes to energy prices, at a time when a lot of these Asian economies have just managed this disinflationary trend that's been intact. Taking a look at oil counters in China, more specifically, we're seeing the CSI 300 Energy Index, the top performer, among the only gainers today. We're seeing that climb on some of these Chinese energy-related stocks, David.
Okay, yeah, really, let's get the latest now. And bring in our Israel Bureau Chief and Senior Mideast Editor Ethan Bronner right now with the latest. Ethan, thanks for coming on very last minute. As you would imagine, of course, the news there really catching the world's attention right now. Why did you get us up to speed of what you're hearing there on the ground? What is the latest there?
Sure, David. So about an hour and a half ago, alarms went off across the country on our phones and everywhere to say that there's an emergency situation. Israel had begun launching major attacks on Iran, on its nuclear facilities, on its infrastructure, and on its military leaders. I believe that they've sought to attack the chief of staff, the chief of the Revolutionary Guard, and so forth. The announcement is, according to the Prime Minister, who did a pre-recorded announcement about it, which appeared shortly thereafter, the goal is to stop Iran from building a nuclear weapon. They say that in recent weeks and months, Iran has been moving rapidly and secretly and inexorably toward a nuclear weapon, that Israel can't allow that to happen. And beyond a nuclear weapon, reconstituting its proxies in the region in an attempt to attack and destroy the state of Israel. That is what the Prime Minister of Israel asserted today. And he said Israel will not put up with it and has attacked.
Ethan, it's certainly a very tense situation. I can imagine where you are, especially. I mean, what are you seeing in terms of Israel bracing for retaliation from Iran?
Israel is bracing. The home front put out an announcement banning school and major gatherings and telling people to stay close to shelters. So far, as far as I'm aware, nothing has been shot at Israel by Iran. That is the expectation. That it'll come. Last time Israel and Iran had a confrontation in October, it's happened twice in October and previously in April. Drones and missiles came, including ballistic missiles. Not much got through, but if Iran is thought to have several thousand ballistic missiles, if it chose to retaliate fully, there is certainly destruction that would occur here. People are concerned. The airport has been closed. And so it's a rather unprecedented situation to have these two powers facing off like this especially because the United States and Iran were in the middle of negotiations. Apparently, the Israelis believed that it was reaching a point of no return and it was not worth waiting for these negotiations to be carried out. They were basically arguing that the Iranians were playing the Americans for time and they weren't going to play along. They said they let the Americans know, but the United States is not taking part in this operation.
Ethan, very fluid situation. If you could just hang on for just about a minute or so. More lines are coming through here. According to Army radio, that Israel has started another round of strikes against Iran. We are now getting further lines coming through here. I'm just going to bring in my Bloomberg terminal a little bit further here. So Israel believes it killed some generals in Iran and atomic scientists. Ethan, to your earlier point, we'll get to more in a moment here. A military official just commenting there on what they know so far have been the result of the strikes earlier on Iranian nuclear sites and Iranian officials. We also understand that the Home Front Command, we anticipate widespread alerts. Again, so Iraq, Iran, and Israel have all closed their respective airspaces. Ethan, can I bring you back in? You alluded to the U.S. angle here, and it's hard to just distance ourselves. In the last few days or so, we know, of course, of news that the U.S. has asked some of its diplomatic staff to take further precautions. More details on that, certainly. Marco Rubio has said this was a unilateral decision on the part of Israel. It's hard to imagine, though, that they did not alert the Americans. What do we know about that situation?
I'm quite sure they did alert the Americans, but I don't think that Rubio was lying. I think it is a purely Israeli operation. I don't think that President Trump wanted to do it. But I don't think he wasn't willing or able to stop the Israelis from doing it. So the basic point is that the Israelis felt that this was something that they had to do from an existential perspective. They had no choice, and they went ahead with it. I mean, I know what you're saying. They obviously have a huge amount of coordination with the United States. If the United States had agreed to participate, there would be a very different level of combat. The Israelis have F-35s and other stealth aircraft, but they don't have anything like the B-2s or B-52s or the 30,000-pound bombs that the Americans have, which would be necessary to get to some of those nuclear sites that are well hidden underground below reinforced concrete and earth. So it's hard to know how much damage Israel can do to the nuclear program. Obviously, to personnel like generals and chiefs of staff, it can. But the general view has been that they could only set back the Iranian program by some months or a year. We'll see if that turns out to be true.
I think Trump is convening the cabinet to meet on this, but we've already been seeing how the U.S. has clearly been distancing themselves from the strike. I mean, it looks like a growing rift between the U.S. and Israel. Does this in any way inform the chances of de-escalation at this point?
Look, that's a good question. I don't think that what we're seeing is growing distance between the two. I mean, it is true that the Israelis have acted without the Americans, but that doesn't seem, from what one can tell, that it's against the Americans' will. I mean, I think that President Trump did say to the Israelis, "Hey, I really would rather you not do this," but it's also clear from his comments that he's not apparently that upset about it, right? I mean, he did say this could happen, and we're not especially eager for it to happen. So I don't see. I think that each sees the other as having interests that it has to pursue, and so far, I don't see a major rift developing. If it were to develop, you're right, that would complicate things enormously.
Ethan, we understand that there is a state of emergency there, to the point you were making earlier on, in anticipation of retaliatory strikes. If you could just give us a sense of the precautions that are being taken in light of perhaps what's possibly coming.
Sure. Well, David, it's 4:30 in the morning, so no one is at school, no one is at work. But school and work have been canceled for Friday, and major gatherings have been banned. So, and the airport has been closed. So that's a lot. And they're also saying they don't know how long it's going to go on. It could go on for days. So, it's about as serious now. Israel is very well protected in terms of shelters, and the apartment I live in has its own shelter in the apartment, not just in the building. People have an enormous amount of that. So there's a general sense that the number of people who would die would be quite low if once there is an attack. But of course, one doesn't know how long it'll go on. It could go on for days or weeks.
Ethan, thank you so much. It's 4 in the morning, as you point out. I imagine it's going to be a very long day for you. Ethan Bronner there, our bureau chief in Israel and senior Middle East editor there for us on the latest from what's taking place on the ground. Right, just to pivot here, the other story that we're tracking, of course, these trade talks, U.S. and China. We're finally getting more clarity on what took place in London, what the agreements and the parameters were from both sides, with two sides agreeing effectively to this framework truce achieved a month ago, if you keep in mind, of course, back in Geneva. We have the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick says America's most advanced chips were never on the table. Let's bring in Stephen Engel, our chief North Asia correspondent, with the context here, because we thought everything was on the table, and now Lutnick is saying, no, most things were, but not this.
Yeah, I mean, we have to talk about this, even though it pales in comparison to the magnitude, of course, of the breaking news in the Middle East, as well as the airplane crash in India. But again, we are kind of dissecting the details of these talks, 20 hours over 2 days in London, that kind of reset, well, that's the wrong word. It brought the relationship on the trade basis back to what they had agreed to a month ago before things got off track a little bit. Those in Geneva, now in London, and now we have to kind of decipher what the actual agreements were, right? And it was basically widely agreed that the United States, it appears, was able to put out its export controls as a point of negotiation. That led to a lot of speculation that perhaps the United States did offer, or at least it was on the table, their export controls on the most advanced chips. Now, that would surprise me if that was the case, but we don't know. They had not clarified that. Well, Howard Lutnick, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, has said emphatically when he was asked, of course not. He says, we're not going to send them our best stuff. We're talking about the big H100, H200 to H20 accelerators from the likes of NVIDIA and the like for AI training and the large language modules. So I think he just pretty much said it was not on the table. And it was, of course, in the Trump administration, negotiation is the way for trade negotiations or trade relations, I should say, and the new era of geopolitics between China and the United States.
Steve, what about China sending U.S. its best stuff, i.e. its leverage, the rare earths?
Yeah, so of course that was the big discussion from the United States. They wanted China, obviously, to speed up the licensing and export processes for critical rare earths. About 30 of the 50 main crucial rare earth minerals that is deemed critical to U.S. ambitions are controlled by China. China has about 80% of the processing of these rare earths. They have about 90% plus of the rare earth magnets, which are critical to the aviation, defense, automobile industries. So they want to see that. But again, that puts the United States at a negotiating disadvantage, as China has used this as a major lever in this new trade war. So that's why Donald Trump, according to sources close telling Bloomberg News, that he is developing a plan, supposedly, to use Cold War era powers known as the Defense Production Act to finance and lend and use other means for the development of America's own rare earth mines. Keep in mind, and we can bring up the stock quote of MP Materials, it's a Las Vegas-based company, is essentially the sole domestic producer of these critical rare earths. The stock was up 14% overnight. It's up 87% year to date. And really, right now, the United States lacks the mine-to-magnet capabilities at scale that China has. China is the world's leading producer of, at least, as I said, 30 of those 50 minerals identified as critical to U.S. interests. Doug Burgum, he's the Interior Secretary, in a Bloomberg interview just a couple of weeks ago, says this is a wake-up call for America. The U.S. stockpiles of these critical minerals are massively insufficient. Dave?
The U.S. president also talking about adding U.S. tariffs on imported cars. What do we know about that?
Yeah, right
that
now,
seems to be separate.
This is about protecting the U.S. auto industry.
Okay.
He said it at the time when he was also signing the bill that essentially does away with that ban on gas-powered cars in California by 2035. Wants to protect domestic industry, just as GM is ramping up its domestic factories and the like. So right now there's a 25% levy on foreign cars imported into the United States, indicating that there could be higher than that. That comes also just a little over a week after he raised the import duties on steel and aluminum to 50%.
Steve, thank you so much. Stephen Engel, our Chief North Asia correspondent there. Very briefly, before we head into the break, talk about the other major stories that we're tracking here as well. Okay, we're getting further lines here out of state TV, out of Iran, that IRGC commander Hussein Salami reportedly killed after these attacks in the last hour or so. From Israel on several sites in Tehran, across Iran as well. Okay, on that news, let's have a look at oil prices right now. So just up across the board, 8% in Shanghai, 6-7% West Texas and Brent, up across the curve. Equity markets within that specific complex are catching a bid, but that's just it. When you look at equity markets, that's the only bright spot effectively across these markets. Havens are bid. Gold is in fact nearing these highs that we hit, well, all-time highs, 34.51, that puts those highs earlier this year very much in sight. Yen is bid, Swiss franc is bid, and as you can see, VIX futures are up by 2.5 points right now to about 21 and change. Plenty more ahead. This is the China Show.
Now, just recapping some of the latest on this Israeli strike on Iran. We know that a number of nuclear sites were hit, and the Israeli IDF head now saying that they went on an offensive because they reached the point of no return. The IDF chief of staff also giving a statement on these attacks on Iran. And of course, Dave, amid all this, we had heard from the US president earlier in the week pretty much saying that, they shouldn't attack these nuclear sites, that a nuclear deal was sort of still on the table. And amid all this, it's really the question marks about what the future relationship of the US and the Israeli sides are going to look like. But for now, we're seeing that reaction in markets, obviously that geopolitical risk premium being built into commodities, oil prices jumping, when just last week we were seeing Brent futures at $60 a barrel. We were watching it in a bearish sort of market, and you're looking at these live pictures now out of Israel. Certainly, all these latest developments have also prompted safe haven bid. We're just looking at these live pictures as well from Jerusalem, Dave.
Yeah, we're just gone past 4 in the morning there in that part of the world. And certainly, again, more lines coming through here. So to Avril's point, right, we did just get the statement out of the chief of staff, out of the IDF. Now, also state TV has reporting, and I believe this is out of Iran here, this one actually coming through in the last 7 minutes specifically, that fire and smoke at the IRGC's command headquarters were spotted in Tehran, that the IRGC commander Hussein Salami reportedly killed. Israel separately said it believes it killed some Iran generals and atomic scientists, and according to Army radio, separately, Israel, in the last few minutes or so, has started another round of strikes against Iran. For more on this, we're joined right now by the senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, Stephen Cook. Stephen, good morning from the Asia Pacific. David here and Avril from Singapore. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Quite a time. Where is your head at the moment? What happens next, do you think?
Well, this is just an extraordinary set of events. The Israelis are using the template that they used against Hezbollah in Lebanon and applying it to Iran. There have been some strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities and military facilities, but it seems, at least in the early going, that they have targeted the regime leadership in the first wave of strikes, believing that if they kill the regime leadership, they will render Iran unable to respond in a major way. It is a risk. Iranians have a significant amount of firepower that they can use against Israel. But clearly the belief is if they kill the leadership of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the army, there are reports that they even targeted the supreme leader himself, that Iran will not be able to muster a very significant or effective response.
I want to get a sense of, I mean, there's so much moving parts here. Where does this leave talks with Iran?
Well, I think that it's right now one has to assume that the Iranians are not going to show up in Muscat for a round of talks over their nuclear program, some of which might not exist. Of course, the Iranians have also vowed that in response to any Israeli strike, that they would target American bases in the Middle East. That would all suggest that the Trump administration's efforts to get a nuclear deal with Iran has now been disabled, perhaps permanently.
Stephen, Avril in Singapore here. As you mentioned, this is sort of Israel repeating the playbook with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And we're hearing about how some of the top military leadership in Iran have been struck. I mean, what does this tell us about maybe what we're seeing in the military side of things when it comes to Iran, the impact ultimately then, how that might trickle through into the conflict?
Well, it seems clear that the Israelis have excellent intelligence. They know where these guys live, they know what their habits are, and they knew exactly where to target them. So, as I said, I think the calculation on the Israeli side is that if you take out the senior leadership of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the military, and others, that it would make it harder for Iran to respond in any kind of effective way. The Israeli leaders have said tonight that they are prepared, and that the country is well defended, and that they're aware of the risks. This would suggest to me that they have very good intelligence about the ability of the Iranians to respond after such a devastating blow in this first round.
And is it also your assessment that, you know, this intelligence was in a way sort of shared with the U.S., that at this point seems to be trying to distance themselves, saying that, you know, Israel undertook this unilaterally?
Well, there's a robust security relationship between the United States and Israel. But of course, Israel sees Iran as an existential threat and has been preparing for a conflict with Iran for 25 years and has been collecting intelligence on Iran for a long time, even before then. So the Israelis, whether they have shared this with the United States or shared all of it with the United States, there's really no way of knowing that that's the case. But they've clearly acted unilaterally on their own information in their own interest. I'll point out that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said in congressional testimony just the other day that it was his belief that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would do what's in the best interest of his country, and that, of course, President Donald Trump would do what's in the best interest of the United States. So it seems clear that there is some daylight between the United States and Israel on this strike. But clearly, American officials understood that the Israelis, if they believe that this is in their interest, that they were going to go ahead and do it.
Stephen, in 20, 30 seconds or so, Israel is saying it's waiting for retaliation. If it does, will the U.S. come to help in its defense?
I think it likely will come to its defense, absolutely.
Okay. Stephen Stephen, thank you so much. Stephen Cook there joining us last minute. We appreciate your time, sir, out of Washington. You're Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations here. So we're continuing to track the market reaction and fallout from these events taking place in the Middle East. We're starting things off here with just a quick glance, a big picture glance at markets across the region here, across assets. Stocks down. FX, as you can see, reflecting the risk aversion out there. Bonds are bid. Gold is up. We're nearing a record there. Oil is substantially higher. Plenty more away in the next hour of the China Show.
Welcome back. You're watching the China Show, and of course, the big story we've been tracking in terms of developments all of today has really been Israeli striking Iran's nuclear site specifically, and really at the heart of the military leadership in the country. We're since hearing from Tasnim. This is a semi-official news agency, I believe, that is sort of affiliated with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and it's saying that the head of the IRGC, Hossein Salami, has been killed in the Israeli attack. So again, striking at the heart of the military leadership in Iran. We're also hearing from Iranian TV saying that several people were killed in Tehran, the capital, as well as other cities. Not quite clear whether this involves civilians or are these further casualties from the leadership in the country. Let's bring in our Bloomberg senior editor, Bill Ferries. So, Bill, obviously this is a very fast evolving situation, but what is your read into this at the moment? I mean, that we're hearing sort of confirmations from the Iranian side that the leadership has been targeted and have been killed. And what do you see as the sense of retaliatory capacity from Iran to Israel?
Yeah, so it's obviously still a very fluid situation. We have that report there that you mentioned of the commander of the IRGC. This is a very senior person who may have been killed. Israel's government saying that it has been targeting in a wave of attacks not just nuclear facilities, but the nuclear personnel who help make those facilities function. So we're talking about scientists and people involved in the technology of enriching uranium. So Israel really going after a wide range of targets so far. Last year, you will remember, there were tit-for-tat strikes between Iran and Israel that happened over the course of several months. Israel at the time said part of those were meant to help take out Iran's anti-aircraft infrastructure, its ability to halt future strikes. Now, it's been more than a year since some of those attacks. Iran would have obviously rebuilt some of that capacity, but it certainly wouldn't have rebuilt all of it. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that these strikes will continue until his government views that the risk has been eliminated. That is a very open-ended commitment, particularly on nuclear facilities, many of which have been hardened against attacks for years, many of which are buried underground. So even though you can have these waves of F-35s and F-15s dropping very large bombs on some of these facilities, it takes a lot to get down and do the damage to really permanently destroy those facilities. So it's not clear, of course, now how many hours or how long this will continue, but some of the signaling from Israel's government suggests that this is not a one-off, that it may continue perhaps in the days ahead.
Bill, we're just getting a line coming through that Donald Trump, the U.S. president, will be attending a National Security Council meeting. The timestamp attached to the headline is 11 a.m. Friday, which I believe should be local time. India will clarify that, but in any case, of course, I would imagine they're talking about this as we speak anyway, given what's taking place there. Bill, we had a guest earlier on, a couple of minutes ago, just on are these live pictures right now? In any case, of course, this is Tehran, of course, where some of the explosions have taken place. Not live, as I'm being told right now. Bill, do we know if these strikes targeted the Supreme Leader, something which was mentioned in our earlier interview? To what extent do we know? Do we have any information on that as well?
I don't think we have any reporting on that ourselves. It would obviously be a huge escalation to go after someone at that level, but I don't think we've seen that directly ourselves. You mentioned President Trump's comments on this. I believe he met with his national security team at Camp David over the weekend. Part of what we think was on the table for discussion were these ongoing nuclear talks between the U.S. and Iran. There have been plans for, I think, a sixth round of talks to perhaps take place this weekend. The U.S. negotiator, Steve Witkoff, had planned to be en route to Oman, where Oman has been hosting these talks. Obviously, we don't know if those are still going to continue. The U.S. Messaging on this has also been very interesting, as I know you guys have been discussing this morning, but Secretary of State Rubio's statement essentially saying that the U.S. has not been involved in this, that it is focusing on protecting its facilities, its military facilities and personnel in the region, and warning Iran against an attack. But that's very different from the more supportive type of language we would have seen, I think, in years past from the U.S. And we know President Trump said, I think at the end of last week, that that he did not, at the time, favor some sort of a retaliatory strike or a strike on Iran.
Bill, to your point about the U.S. messaging and Rubio insisting that the U.S. has no involvement, do you think Iran will view it in that way?
Well, it has in the past. I mean, if you look at the strikes that took place just over a year ago, it started just over a year ago between the two sides. Iran launched a very large missile and drone barrage against Israel, and Israel responded by going after some key radar and military facilities. The U.S. made a kind of a similar statement at the time, saying it was not really involved in that process, and Iran largely seemed to kind of, I guess, respect that. Whether they will do so this time remains to be clear. You have to remember Iran's capacity has really been damaged, not just last year, but in recent years by the conflicts with Israel. And so their ability to have some kind of multi-front conflict is really limited in this case. I expect if and when they likely retaliate, the focus will be almost exclusively on Israel.
Yeah, questions swirling as to Iran's retaliatory capacity. Thank you so much, Bill Ferry is our senior editor for us now. We also want to talk about the market reaction amid all this. Joey Chu is head of Asia FX research at HSBC, and she joins me in the studio now. So, Joey, I mean, we meant to talk about something else, but, you know, geopolitical risk is kind of taking over. We're seeing the dollar catching a haven bid, you know, that spike not quite against the yen and the Swiss franc. I mean, how are you looking at all this?
You know, I think it's interesting that you point out that dollar is gaining in this round of risk off. I mean, we actually haven't seen the dollar activating its safe haven role in a while. So I think it's a huge relief, I guess, and suggests that de-dollarization is not that simple a theme, right? So perhaps I think one thing we can take away is that maybe when the policy uncertainty or when the risk aversion is stemming from US side, then perhaps the dollar sort of fails a little bit. But when it's coming from external geopolitical tensions outside of the US, then maybe the dollar still actually holds its own. So I think this introduces, you know, this idea that de-dollarization is not as rapid or as straightforward as a lot of market participants might think.
As we are watching the haven plays and how they're catching a bid, I think we're also seeing gold flirting with a record high. I mean, what do you see as the trajectory going forward, given the geopolitical risk premium that seems to be building back into markets?
I think for gold and for a lot of others, you know, alternative reserve currencies or safe havens like the yen and Swiss franc, I would say that overall, you know, it still points to further strength, be it from geopolitical risk, US policy uncertainty risk, or even the prospect of Fed cuts coming into play into the second half of the year now that US inflation is starting to surprise on the downside. So all these things are quite supportive of all these other currencies and assets.
Joey, David here. If we had to sort of figure out which were the sort of prime candidates for if the dollar short squeeze continues, are there any pairs or exchange rates that come to mind right now?
Yeah, so in terms of the dollar short squeeze, I mean, we have to look at where the positioning is the largest. Actually, the positioning in terms of G10 is probably the largest in the yen, but I don't think we can expect, anybody to actually take off their long yen positions at this juncture. So elsewhere, I would say that perhaps there were some carry trades or risk-on trades that were being put on, say, earlier this week or last week. So Aussie, Kiwi, and then in EM, there's a lot of, carry trades that were potentially entered into last week, like LATAM in Asia, maybe INR, so these are the ones that could see a bit of a squeeze.
Understood. Okay, do rate differentials matter, do you think, the next 24 or 48 hours?
Yeah, I think the dollar and the rate differential relationship sort of broke down in April and May, and it's very hard to see them completely recouple. There are a lot of things going on, so I think right now maybe rather than thinking about rate differentials, perhaps it's more important to think about positioning first. But that being said, I totally understand where you're coming from, because the idea of Fed rate cuts coming into play is suddenly very much in focus with all the recent data surprises out of the US. I think once the geopolitical tensions calm down, we could refocus on this theme about how the cyclical support for the dollar is also starting to break.
Sorry if I'm overstepping your point here, but does your view then, I mean, is it that the dollar is undervalued at this point? And we see how the consensus view is for the dollar to head lower. I mean, what's the...
I don't think anybody would say that the dollar is undervalued, because if you look at, say, the trajectory of the dollar over the last 10 years, there's still some correction to go back to, say, the long-term average. But definitely from a positioning perspective, there were a lot of short dollar positions being put on, over the last 2 to 3 months. So that could get squeezed a little bit as people take profit or reassess.
Joey, can you talk to us as well about the disinflationary trend that's sort of been seen across Asia, and how the spike in oil prices now? I mean, we're seeing Brent above 73 a barrel, I think. How is this going to affect central banks in the region and the FX?
Yeah, it does complicate things a little bit, because we are starting to see Asian central banks being a bit more aggressive with rate cuts. For example, RBI cutting by 50 basis points. A lot of this is predicated on the fact that the demand growth is slowing down, so that is causing disinflation. Currencies are strong, also causing disinflation. But I think what you point out about oil prices is worth monitoring. But for now, I would say that central banks tend to overlook supply shocks and focus more on the demand, disinflationary type of aspect to oil prices.
Okay, what else are we missing as we look at these headlines coming in? We're weighing out what the path for the Fed is going to be. What else should we be keeping an eye on?
Actually, I think we should also be looking at RMB, because if you look at dollar RMB today, it's quite interesting. So dollar RMB, first of all, rebounded from last night's de-dollarization because of the risk-off, together with all dollar Asia pairs. But once the fixing came in a little bit lower than 718, then we started to see some reversal of that as well. So the fixing below 718 is interesting, as we know, because ever since the trade truce, they have actually sort of held it at 718, and so now breaking 717 suggests that it's not just about tariffs or whether tariffs are up or tariffs are down. Fixing is also starting to react to the broad dollar trend.
And the signal from the PBOC is guiding the renminbi stronger. What about when it comes to carry trades?
Yeah, carry trades are tricky. I mean, honestly, last week, probably when volatility across the board was down, maybe, carry trades look a little bit more attractive. We also suggested some carry trades ourselves, but obviously now volatility is back up, and so it's a little bit difficult. I think at this juncture, market has to grapple between, occasionally doing carry trades and occasionally doing the de-dollarization trades, just trying to flit between these two themes.
Okay, Joey. Thank you for coming in and sharing your insights with us on what we're seeing in the dollar moves. Obviously, that is the big mover when it comes to markets today. Joey Cheung, head of Asia FX Research at HSBC for us. Coming up, more on the Air India crash, which killed 241 people, making 2025 one of the deadliest years for civil aviation in a decade. We'll speak to Amit Singh from the Safety Matters Foundation next. This is Bloomberg.
Right. Two breaking news that we're tracking here, two big stories, rather. The breaking news out of Israel and Iran specifically. We now understand, of course, some of the senior military figures that have been killed in Iran, and we're continuing to track the story, including, of course, the market fallout. And we're just moving into 5:15 in the morning, of course, there in Israel. And we are, of course, waking up to an escalation as far as tensions go there, and of course as far as the airspace goes. Iran, Israel, and Iraq separately in the last few hours or so have said that their airspaces are closed, and that Israel is bracing for retaliation from Iran. We'll revisit that story in a couple of minutes, but just to get you up to speed as well, in the next few minutes or so, we understand that Donald Trump, or at least the next few hours or so, Donald Trump will be attending, of course, a National Security Council meeting. Okay, the other big story that we're tracking, and here we go. We are now getting news on the Air India plane crash that one of the two black boxes have been found from the crash site. That's what we know so far. We'll keep on top of the details for you. In fact, right now, let's get more on the story. Perhaps what we need to be paying attention to as far as information and data from the black box is concerned because of the crash of Air India Flight 171. Let's bring in our guest right now. Joining us is Amit Singh, founder at Safety Matters Foundation, an NGO that promotes dialogue and safety. He's also a commercial pilot who has worked for AirAsia and Indian Airlines. Amit, good morning, and thank you for coming on the show. With the limited information that we have now, some of the videos that have been circulating, what do you understand to have happened here?
Well, in any investigation, there is a technical side and a non-technical, which is the human factors side. Looking at the technical, because that is what we can make out from the videos, the aircraft rolls down the runway as one of the survivors has told the media that there was a loud sound, a bang, which could be probably an engine stall or some kind of an engine problem. That is a probability. And we can see from the flight radar data that the aircraft lifts off toward the edge of the runway. And in the video, we see a plume of dust which blows, which means there's an unpaved surface that side. The only probability is that the aircraft basically suffers an engine failure with 50% of the thrust. The aircraft is committed to take off and consumes a large part of the runway to get airborne. Getting airborne is fine. The aircraft is certified to fly with one engine. And thereafter, in a normal takeoff, in 5 seconds after liftoff, as a muscle memory, the pilots put the landing gear up or the wheels up. But here we see the wheels are still down, which means probably there's some kind of a distraction at that moment, 5 to 10 seconds before or just after takeoff. There has been some event which has distracted the pilots and which they could not concentrate because the pilot flying is kind of responsible for calling out the gear up command, and the other pilot with the gear up. It doesn't mean that the other pilot doesn't monitor, but there has been some event in the cockpit that we will come to know through the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder once they are downloaded. So now we see the gear is down, which is causing a lot of drag. And the aircraft climbs, then slowly mushes down. And in the last moments, there's a desperate attempt to keep the aircraft in flight, and the nose keeps going up, which means the pilot is pulling the stick up to keep the aircraft airborne. But the engine thrust is not sufficient to keep the aircraft airborne. So we need the speed because the air has to flow above the wings to create the lift. And to get the speed, we need the engine thrust. So in all probability, there is a loss of thrust in that aircraft. Now, have they shut down the wrong engine or not? Because in the past, there have been cases. A 320 right over Delhi, just after takeoff, suffered an engine problem, a bird hit on engine number 2, the right-hand engine. And in some confusion within the cockpit, they shut down the healthy engine, which is engine number 1. So for a few seconds, they had loss of both engine thrust right over the populated part of Delhi. British Midlands was an aircraft crash, and so was in Taipei an ATR. So probability of human factor comes in here, wherein is it that a wrong engine was shut down, which resulted in both engines being shut down at the same moment. So that will come to know after the investigation is complete.
Yeah, and one of the two black boxes have been found, as we mentioned there as well. Now, Amit, so you mentioned that something might have distracted the pilot. It was too late, to your point, to abort the takeoff because they had gone 50% of the runway. They've taken off. Clearly, there was not enough lift. You mentioned something that may have distracted the pilot. And again, at this point, it's important to underscore we're speculating because we don't have the data on this. What do you think that might have been, as a former pilot? And if they did shut down one of the engines by mistake, does that have anything to do with the flaps, for example? Because there has been attention on the flaps. If there is any observation that you've made so far based on the videos we've seen, Amit.
Based on the videos, it is very clear that the flaps, I see the slats, which is the front part of the wing, is extended. And so would the flaps be, which is the trailing part of the wing. So when you extend the flaps, the slats also come out. So unless there is some technical failure wherein there is uncommanded retraction of the flap, the probability is less, but I can very clearly see the slat extended. So there is no confusion in that. There is a lot of speculation, yes, but once the videos are clear and the data is downloaded, this issue will be sorted out. The probability of the aircraft coming down is only because of the thrust. Even if the flaps are retracted, because the aircraft has got airborne. Once the aircraft gets airborne, which means sufficient lift was being generated at the time of getting airborne, why wouldn't the aircraft keep afloat or stay in the climb mode with the amount of thrusts the aircraft has? The aircraft has certain reserve thrust. The temperatures were not so high, 37 degrees. Delhi is already at 42, 43 degrees. So the aircraft has very powerful engines because one engine is supposed to sustain the whole aircraft, fully loaded aircraft for certification purposes. So that is not an issue. Yeah. So only distraction could have been a word or something like that.
Well, and again, we'd love to hear from you once we have more information from one of the black boxes that we understand has been found. And again, thank you so much for standing by and for joining us fairly last minute as well on this. Amit Singh there.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for right now, at least, founder at Safety Matters Foundation. Because of the breaking news right now, this is on Israel and Iran, that the RNA is saying that Iran is planning a decisive response to the Israeli attack. That newsline coming through in the last 2 minutes or so. And just before that, more context here that Iran's IRGC chief, Hussein Salami, has been killed in those attacks in the last few hours or so. If you want to keep on top of the story for our Bloomberg clients, TLIV Go on your Bloomberg terminal, get you the latest context analysis and also all the reporting coming through that we have so far as well. Plenty more ahead here. You're watching Bloomberg. More on the breaking news coming through, more information coming through here. As you can see, oil prices are now up over 10%. Iranian TV has reported an explosion at a nuclear site in Natanz. Separately, and we're not sure if this is related to that headline coming through, an explosion at the Shahid Ahmadi Roshan nuclear site, also according to Iran TV, those coming through in the last 2 minutes or so. If you're just joining us right now, Iran is also planning a decisive response to the Israeli attack. So those are the latest news lines coming through. As you can see, oil prices are on the way up about 10%. West Texas, Brent up across the board. Shanghai crude is also up about 10%. To keep on top of the story, we'll have more on this, but while we take a break, you can glance at TLIV Go for our Bloomberg clients. Plenty more ahead. Right. Welcome back. Breaking news coverage, of course, of these strikes, airstrikes in Iran from Israel. And the latest is reporting an explosion here at a nuclear site in Iran. An explosion is there out of Iranian TV reporting. As you can see, West Texas is up about 10%. In fact, right now, it's worth pointing out in terms of context, that is session highs right now we're seeing in terms of oil prices. Time of the day right now in Israel, we've just gone past or going into 5:30 in the morning as really we wake up. Many people are waking up in that part of the world, not just in Israel, to an escalation that somewhat was expected based on some market reporting, some reporting going into this morning in the Asia time, but certainly with the confirmations we've had so far from both sides, an escalation certainly that markets are continuing to digest, including potentially, and it looks like to be the case here, a decisive response, according to Iran, to Israel based on that attack. Let's get a market context right now. Mark Cranfield is with us out of Singapore to talk us through this. Mark, among the many things we've been tracking right now, we're all yours. What are you paying attention to?
Well, we're getting the usual grab for the havens, such as the Swiss franc and the Japanese yen, as you would expect. Equities are certainly taking quite a hit as well. And yet the slightly surprising thing here is that it's relatively isolated in some respects. What you're seeing is calm in U.S. Treasuries. Oil prices, of course, are sparking. But if you look at the wider Asian equities, they're down, but it's not really disastrous by any means at all. So maybe there's a slight feeling here. People are stepping back and suggesting that, yes, this is very oil-specific, commodity-specific, but maybe it's not going to translate into a fuller global meltdown kind of picture that we've seen at other times as well. Interestingly, people will be looking at the US dollar and thinking that where's the haven bid for the dollar? Typically in times of a crisis, if this is going to pan out to be a crisis, you would expect the dollar to be strong across the board. That's not really the case. It's a little bit stronger against some currencies, but it's not hardly going gangbusters against many. In fact, if you look at the euro's only weakened very slightly, and that's the real key indicator for whether people are buying the US dollar or not. So this is also going to get people flipping back to thinking about the overall stance of the United States, and particularly their relationship with Israel on a macro sense. So if you're an investor on a broad spectrum of things, you may well be thinking here that US isolation policy is not going to be good for its currency, and it might not be good for some of its markets as well. People will be looking for other places. It's going to be very interesting how the G7 deal with this over the weekend, because it's surely going to be one of the hot topics for them. And we may well start to see some divisions there, which give us a clue as to where asset markets go next week, how the Europeans line up, how Japan and China come into play as well. It is going to be one of the more interesting G7 meetings we've had for a very long time.
Yeah, and there's still an entire trading day left as the Middle East, Europe, eventually the U.S., and an entire weekend between now and then, Mark, where anything could really happen. Mark, I'm looking at gold prices right now. I mean, effectively, let's call it record highs. Does this continue, this haven bid here across gold?
It will make sense. It's one of the easiest ones to understand. It's obviously been getting a lot of support from central banks along the way anyway. They've been the theme of people moving away from the US dollar is probably the consistent one that will retain whatever happens in financial markets today. We're going to see a lot of volatility, of course, and choppy trading. But this theme that has begun, particularly since President Trump became president, since he took the role in January, the US dollar has started to weaken. People are moving away from it. It looks like it's got a lot further to go. Yesterday, we were discussing about Paul Tudor Jones saying there could be a 10% decline overall for the US dollar. That is all playing into the same thing. Gold is the flip side of that. Central banks were already moving into it as an alternative to the US dollar. Any kind of tension like this in the Middle East obviously is very supportive for gold as well. All the reasons for continuing to hold gold are stacking up. There is certainly anybody who's been thinking it's a positive case is just getting reinforcement here. All of these things are coming together, and it's just making the case very strong. And particularly when you see cryptos underperforming as well. People might have expected to see a flight into Bitcoin or Ethereum. That's not happening. It's only gold which is benefiting from this. And that really is underlying the case that it seems to be one of the few things that people can agree on under all conditions, that gold is the one to go to.
I mean, it applies to life and it does to markets, doesn't it? That we really know how things behave under extreme stressful conditions like this. For example, we know what a risk asset and a haven is, I think, at this point in time. Mark, I think back to the earlier point you were making on U.S. policy and what it means for bond markets. Effectively, bond yields are falling today, maybe because of what's happening in Israel, Iran, maybe because of the auctions. Where's your head now when it comes to treasuries and the bid we're seeing, at least in the last, let's call it 2 days or so?
Yeah, that might not last too long, because before long people have to go back to the real fundamentals, and the big one coming up is this tax and spending bill that the United States is looking at. If that bill passes in the kind of form that it's being presented as it is now, it is clearly negative for the U.S. fiscal deficit situation. That is going to get even worse than it is already. So we'll get these short-term movements that related to bond auctions. Of course, people were going into the auctions fairly short anyway, so you would have expected some kind of a Treasury bid once they're out of the way. But the bigger picture is that the fiscal situation in the United States is deteriorating. It's probably going to get even worse, and that is no good especially for the long end of the Treasury curve. More steepening, more weakness in the 30-year sector. That's all likely to happen down the road. Whatever's happening today, this might have been a good week for Treasuries. It is probably not going to be a good year for Treasuries.
Mark, thank you so much. Mark Cranfield there in Singapore for us on the latest when it comes to markets. Certainly front and center to Mark's point. One of the easiest places to look is the oil market and oil complex. As you can see, we're up now 12% on Brent. I'm looking at my screens right now. 12% takes you all the way back. We haven't seen a daily move of this magnitude going back about 5 years, early May of 2020. And markets, I feel right now, we started off with 5-7%, are just starting to get warmed up given all the new information we're just getting, in fact, out of Iran as I speak. Let's get a sense of what this means for the oil complex. Sara Vakhshouri, president and founder of strategic energy consulting firm SVB International, joining us right now. Sara, thank you for joining us fairly last minute on this story. We're all yours. How are you thinking about oil markets right now?
Well, definitely this major escalation has shifted the risk landscape and what the market is perceiving regarding the risk. We had kind of the market being desensitized toward the geopolitical risks in the past year, seeing most of the tension as perceived uncertain or just a theoretical, hypothetical tensions, balance of power, measured actions. But definitely what just happened hours ago was an actual escalation of relation between Iran and Israel, the attacks in northern Tehran. So it's just the magnitude of risk have been shifted significantly.
Talk to us more about that, because you're right. We've seen recent episodes of oil markets reacting 1-2 days and then things go away. Why do you think this one is different?
So there are multiple factors. One is the psychological impact on the traders, which definitely is immediate and more and stronger than before, because we had the U.S. government definitely evacuating some of its personnel and families from the region in the past days. And also the surprise attack, the magnitude, it's a real attack. Again, as I said, is not anymore hypothetical. Its tension is an active conflict. So the psychological impact on traders, also on algorithms, definitely is huge. The other factor is the market fundamentals. So if you look at this year and compared to last year, this year market is much tighter, because if you look at it, I know despite some of the media headlines that OPEC Plus increasing the production and the market is oversupplied, this is not the true story, because if you look at the inventories, we are moving toward a summer, which is a seasonal high demand. So we are seasonally moving into a higher demand season, but also we have tight inventories in compared to last year and also previous years. But looking at OPEC Plus had to unwind some of its production, so the spare capacity is also tighter than last year. So if we want to look at the risk premium, not only we have an active conflict, which is going to have significant psychological impact, but also the market fundamentals are tight. Now, all we can do is just to wait for the next 24 or 72 hours and see what would be Iran's reaction. Would this end at where it is now, or it's going to escalate beyond this?
Well, we have some description of what type of retaliation that might be. in fact, we're just getting, in fact, a line as you were just finishing your answer there, that Iran will deliver what they describe as harsh retaliation to those attacks. So let's put that together with a price move right now. 12.5%, 13% move up. Do you see scope for further gains right now in oil markets today, Sara?
So again, it depends on, we can perceive multiple scenarios of how this active conflict is going to move forward. But if you wanted to look into last year's kind of balance of power or measured attack that Iran and Israel had on each other, somehow Iran's missiles were not effective. So many are anticipating that if Iran wants to retaliate, would retaliate, for instance, on some of the U.S., let's say, assets or bases in the region. How would have impact on the infrastructure? What would be U.S. response? So far, U.S. announced that they were not involved in this attack and encouraged Iran not to drag U.S. into this conflict. Also, on Sunday, there was a meeting going to be happening in Oman between U.S. and Iran. So I think it's very early to really anticipate, but yes, there are multiple scenarios, including the threats against the infrastructure that will intensify the threat against global energy security. These are the risks and uncertainties that market is perceiving. And as I said, we have now a risk premiums that are more real and compared to years or at least last year, the flares up that we had last year. So we have a psychological impact, we have a tight market, and we also have perceived scenarios that market is going to look the uncertainties over safeties of infrastructures or choke points. But again, all of this is too early to talk about it. And I think it's short term, and market could adjust itself depending on where the tension is going to head.
I mean, most certainly to the point you just made there, it seems that most things are now on the table, and most of those factors perhaps weren't on the table in previous episodes here. And yeah, just to underscore the point you're making, that on Sunday was supposed to be the 6th round of nuclear talks in Oman with Iran there. And I think the special envoy, Steve Witkoff of the U.S., was scheduled, in fact, to travel to Oman. Sara, final question. I've herded you into specific answers and questions there. Have we missed anything?
I think for me, when I look at the market, I look at the psychological impact. I look at the headlines, how algorithms, how traders will read that. The market fundamentals, that is obviously tighter than last year. The spare capacity is limited compared to last year. And also all the risk premiums that market and all those scenarios that market is perceiving. Something that we cannot predict is that how significant was the attack, because we don't know how surprisingly was for Iranian government and how their retaliatory actions would be. Would it be just symbolic, like previous retaliation that they had, that it didn't really escalate and was just meant to de-escalate? Or are they going to be follow-up on the talks, or things are going to be going out of hand? This is something that I really can't predict, and I really suggest no one to do that. But I mean, market and traders would have certain risk premiums included in their tradings, as you already described, impacting the prices. But some of these fluctuations are very short-term, and depending on how the events are going to unfold in the next 24 hours or 72 hours, then the market will have a better idea on how the trend of oil prices is going to move and how the market is going to adjust itself.
Sara, we appreciate your time. I know it's getting late there in Washington. Thank you so much for the context and certainly the key areas of focus we should be paying attention to. Sara Vakhshouri, their president and founder, SVB Energy International, joining us from out of Washington. Right, 5 weeks ago, we were below $60 in Brent. We're now flirting with $80 because of today's, let's call it 13% pop in oil prices. Right, more on the breaking news coming through, more information coming through. Iran says the U.S., Israel will receive a harsh blow in response to this, and also we're getting more information on some flight halts on this route to Israel have also been diverted. The bigger picture here in terms of airspace, Israel, Iran, and Iraq in the last 2 hours or so have all come out and said that they have closed their airspace until further notice. That and more information on T-Live for our Bloomberg clients. You can turn to that for all the latest, the summaries, context, an analysis on these market moves and also some commentary from other analysts we've been in touch with over the last few hours or so. Developing story here. More on the breaking news ahead. You're watching The China Show.
Moments ago, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival. This operation will continue for as many days as it takes to remove this threat.
Remarks there which actually ended from Benjamin Netanyahu about 2 hours ago, following the information on the attacks, and certainly just from that point in time, we've received a lot of new information and developments here coming through. And the latest here coming out of Iran, that they said that they will harshly retaliate against the U.S. and Israel over these attacks. Marco Rubio, at about the same time, in fact, that you heard that statement from Benjamin Netanyahu early on, came out and said, what happened today, and I'm just going to paraphrase to make this very, very, very simple and short, what happened today was a unilateral action from Israel. The U.S. was not involved in these strikes with Iran, and our top priority is protecting American forces there in the region. Let me be clear, he says, Iran should not target U.S. interests or personnel. Now, on that very point, we also asked that question because there's a difference between the attack and the defense of Israel, which our earlier guest pointed out that if indeed we did see Iran retaliate against Israel, they thought that the U.S., that would be a different proposition altogether, and the U.S. would help in that defense there as well. To get a broader sense of what the diplomatic cables and lines are looking at as we speak right now, we're joined by former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, James Jeffrey, joining us out of Washington. Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Fairly last minute, fairly late your time. What's next?
First of all, we don't know what's next. What we do know is this is a dramatic development. It's the culmination of everything in essentially a regional war between Israel, joined by the U.S., Arab states, Turkey, and others since the 7th of October, 2023, to push back Iran's threat to the region. This is the ultimate action. The Israelis are determined not just to do a pinprick, but to take out much of the Iranian command and control, including the IRGC leader. Salami has already been confirmed killed, and also much of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, including their weaponization program in Pachin.
Ambassador, question to you. I'm not sure if you heard me right before we brought you in. I asked this question to our other guests earlier on. If we do see Iran retaliate, do you think the U.S. will come to the defense of Israel?
The U.S. will provide, I think, a variety of facilitations. You saw Marco Rubio's statement. He's absolutely correct because, frankly, U.S. bases in the Gulf are more vulnerable to Iran than Israel is. Iran has far more short-range systems that can strike us in the Gulf than can reach Israel. That requires long-range missiles, and most of them have been used or destroyed. And frankly, our air defenses are probably not as good as Israel's. That said, and Rubio is right, I don't think the Iranians will strike U.S. bases. If they do, they're at war with us. It'll be seen as a Pearl Harbor. And of all people, Donald Trump has made it clear he does not self-restrain, which most presidents since World War II have.
Ambassador, over the next, let's call it 24 hours, do you see a temporary diplomatic solution, a path to de-escalate the situation as things stand?
No. Israel now having taken this step, and I have studied the Israeli Prime Minister. I worked closely with him for 2 years on Syria a few years ago. He knows that having taken this step, They cannot stop until they have destroyed the Iranian nuclear capability. That's the Fordow site, that's the Natanz site, that's the Pachin nuclear weaponization site, and probably other sites we don't know of. I would not be surprised if you see ground operations. What they have done is a targeted command and control strike, taking out the Iranian leadership, both the nuclear program and the IRGC. That means that Iran is blind right now. It's operationally blind, and Israelis will be able to operate in various ways. They're not going to stop until Iran's nuclear capacity is buried.
What would be the definition of that?
That's a good question. Countries can resurrect nuclear systems, particularly with the help of others. And as you know, Iran has good ties with China and even better ones, including a defense relationship with Russia. And Iran has access to uranium. It has certainly access to the knowledge. You can't kill all the scientists. Nonetheless, Israel feels it has to set back the program in order to, if nothing else, deter Iran from ever really thinking it can strike Israel with nuclear weapons.
Ambassador, President Trump is scheduled to attend a national security meeting. What do you think is going to take place there?
Well, first of all, as any president, and I've experienced this working for President Trump, he's going to care deeply about U.S. forces. He's going to first ask, how will we protect them? Have we signaled to the Iranians not to strike them? We've seen the Rubio statement. Trust me, I'm sure there are other quieter channels that have been turned on. And then he'll decide, what do we do if this thing continues? How strongly do we support Israel? Finally, the really tough question will be, what do we do if U.S. bases are struck, as, for example, they were struck after Trump ordered the killing of the prior IRGC Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani. So those are the questions. I've been in about 100 of these meetings. Those are the obvious questions that are going to come up.
Final question for you, Ambassador. I'm cognizant how I phrase this in terms of tenses. Let me use past tense, and correct me if I'm wrong. The sixth round of talks was scheduled to take place in Oman between the U.S. and Iran around the nuclear conversations there this coming Sunday. Do you suspect those talks are now off, or can those conversations still take place amidst developments as we speak?
They did. And partially, Iran killed it. Trump offered them everything but, we say in American English, the kitchen sink, to try to get a deal that would even allow them to enrich for a period of time. You know, a deal that was 5% better than the Obama deal from 2015. And the Iranians said, basically, screw you. This led to both the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, delivering a blistering report, and the board, for the first time in almost 20 years, basically saying we have an Iranian effort to obtain nuclear weapons, and over to you, Security Council. That was just yesterday, or actually earlier today, I'm sorry. So these were very dramatic developments, and I think at this point, there's no going back. Iran's systems are going to have to be taken out either by the Israelis, or if we get dragged in, we'll do it.
Well, it's somewhat happened already. I think that's why we're here. Ambassador, thank you so much for the time. Former U.S. Ambassador there to Iraq and Turkey, James Jeffrey, joining us out of Washington. Before we go, as we pass on the baton, of course, to our colleagues on the next show, just a brief look at markets. And you know what? I'm going to make this very short. They're not in good shape right now, particularly risk assets. Plenty more ahead here on Bloomberg Television. Thanks for joining us today.